Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you that are here now, and you guys watching it later. I'm Victor by name, Victor Oko, and today I'm going to take you on callbacks, promises, then brief introduction to async and await. So we're going to see how these three play out and how to use them. Let's look at the topics we are going to cover. We are going to find out what callbacks are. We are going to also find out what anonymous function is. What's asynchronous programming? So how does asynchronous programming work? Then we would also talk about what a promise is, and we are going to see different state of a promise. Then and how to actually use promises. Then we are also going to see how we can use the promise.all method. Then will see how we use promise.raise too. And we'll see the difference between promise.all and promise.raise method. Then we'll also talk about async and await. So let's dive into it. So what are callbacks? A callback is a function that you pass into another function as an argument for executing later. So if we if you've worked with programming, you find out that most times you pass a function into another function, for example, and then that function is being called maybe um, after you call the outer function somewhere, then that inner function would be called maybe after something is being processed or so. So that function that you pass as an argument to um, like as an argument to another function is called a callback. So this is an example of a callback. So we have this function here, display result, and then we have result here. And then we have my calculator as another function. And then this my calculator takes in two parameters, like it takes in, like, let's say two numbers, and then it takes in a callback which I call my callback. And we are saying when we pass that callback in as an argument here, we want to pass the result of adding the first and the second argument. So we pass that callback to C, and then we see that when we pass that callback to C and that callback runs, that callback is this display result. So this display result will just console.log out the result. So if we run this now, what is going to happen is my calculator will be the first function called. Then my calculator will add A and B, and then it will result to C. And then we are passing C to the callback. Then since we are passing C to that callback, and then the callback here when we are calling the function is display results, which is this display result. Then what is going to happen is after adding these two, it will pass the results of adding these two to display results. So then this display results will now execute. So that is going to result in an output of 10. So that's how callbacks actually work. So it's a pretty simple concept. So another thing you can do is instead of writing this callback um, separately like this, you can actually write the callback in the function. Then that will become an anonymous function. So this particular display result and result here, you can put it, instead of writing uh, display results here, you can write 5 and 5, then you write in an anonymous function. So now let's talk about what an anonymous function is. So what is an anonymous function? So first, let's talk about what, when we say something is anonymous, we actually mean that that thing is maybe untraceable, or it has no trace to it, or it has no name to it, that we, or it has no identity to it. So when we say something is anonymous, it doesn't have any identity. You can't identify. It's just like say maybe like, so, for example, someone stole your phone. If you know the person, then that person that stole your phone doesn't is no more anonymous to you. But if someone stole your phone and you don't know the person, then in a way that person is anonymous to you. So you don't know him, but you know that someone has actually done something. Someone has taken your phone. So that's, so anonymous function is it's simply a function that has no name. So we can't, you can see the function what it's doing, but it doesn't have a name. So which means you can, you can only call it here, but maybe outside here, since it doesn't have a name, you can refer to that particular function. So an example is set timeout. Now this function here is acting as an anonymous function and is also acting as a callback. So we say set timeout, and then we pass an anonymous function, and then if you're familiar with JavaScript, you know that set timeout would wait for 3 seconds. So this 3000 here represents milliseconds. So computer understands milliseconds. So if you want this program to wait for 3 seconds before consoling, like logging out hello, then this is how you write it. You pass an anonymous function, which is also a callback. So if you run the code, it runs the anonymous function after 3 minutes. So let's see how anonymous functions and how they are being used with callbacks. So let me write that same example with using an anonymous function. So I'll say function calculate this, and then I'll say uh maybe 1 or 6 and 10, and then I say callback, for example. I say um okay, this is not going to be 6 and 10, this is going to be A and B. I say let result equals to A plus B. Of course, let result equals to A and B, and then I say the callback should have results passed in there. Of course, what I could do is, when I'm calling this function, I could do something like calculate this, and then I say maybe 6 and 4, and then out here I now say function. Of course, uh, maybe I'll just name that what I'm passing into the callback as value. Now say console.log a value. So if we run that, we see that this actually runs. So if you don't want to actually write this function in here, and you want to give it a name, maybe because you might want to use that function somewhere else in your code. So you can give it a name, maybe um, show this. So it's basically the same thing. And of course, you could still call show this somewhere else, maybe show this and oh sorry, show this and say hello. Yeah. So passing so one reason why you might want to pass a function in as an anonymous function is you just want that function to run once and you're not going to reuse that function in anywhere. But if I wanted a function to be reused somewhere else and I want that function to be passed as a callback to another function, for example, then I could write it this way. So I write this function separately and I pass it as an argument to a function that accepts a callback as an argument. So I hope that's clear. Um, I hope you guys are following. Okay. So you guys are following. So that's a simple way to actually use a callback function. And you can also play around with this callback function. If you put it here, and let me try this. So if you put that there, you can call show this here. I think that is also going to yield the same result. So yeah, it still yields the same result. So you can, I think, can do this. So if I say, let me see if that works out. Okay, say says A and B is not defined. Okay, cool. Although I didn't need to do this, I could just write others. So you can use this with your spread. So you can put in 5 here and then as much to you can use this to catch any other argument. So so the callback doesn't necessarily need to be the last argument. It could actually be the first argument, and then you can use a spread to catch every other thing the user has put in, and then you can decide to maybe add whatever the user puts in here and the rest. So that's how that works. Callback. So let's continue. Okay. So let's look at asynchronous programming. So asynchronous programming is a technique that enables you to program your program to start a potentially long running task, and then rather than having to wait until that task has finished to be able to continue. Okay, it allows your application to be responsive to other events while that particular task runs. Then once that task is completed, your program is presented. So this concept of asynchronous programming just means that, you know, some, you know, if you run like the way we've been actually running our program, so it goes sequentially. It's finished one part of the code, then it goes to another part. It runs like sequentially from top to bottom, right? So what if you had, now that is in a way blocking, because you can't, let's say you have uh 20 things at the same time, and you want maybe one of those 20 things that you're trying to run, maybe you have 20 functions you're calling, and then one of those 20 functions is going to actually take time to run, but you want it that while this that one function is running, and then is trying to compile its results and maybe return a value, other functions can still run and return their values pending when that one function that isn't prepared will return its own result. So that's where asynchronous programming comes in. So it enables your program to, still keep running while something is happening on the background. Maybe uh, a task that is delaying gets resolved, or something, but it won't stop your code from like other function in your code or other things on your code from actually executing. So with that said, so it's just like saying in real life, it's like saying okay, you're hungry, you want to eat, and then while you're cooking, maybe you went to cook the food, and while you're cooking, if there was no asynchronous programming, while you're cooking you can only cook. You can't check your phone while cooking, or do any other thing while cooking. You can only cook at that particular time, and then maybe after you finish cooking, that's when you can now, maybe you have to eat before maybe you check your phone. But asynchronous programming in real life is like you're hungry, you're cooking, but as you're cooking, you can check your phone. You can maybe you can sleep. I know your food will burn sharp, but you can sleep. You can do other things while you're cooking your food, pending when that food will be done. Then when that food is done, you can eat the food while still texting or while still doing any other thing you want to do. So that's how asynchronous code works. So now let's talk about promise. So promise is an object that's okay. So the first thing you need to understand is promise is an object. So we instantiate objects by using the new keyword. We'll see how that works. So the, a- the promise object represents that an eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. So we can also say that a promise can be defined as an object that encapsulates the rest of an asynchronous operation. So in simple sense, a promise is just is an object that has it has resolve and it has reject. Like, okay, let me compare it to real life. So a promise is like a real life promise. So let's say you enter a restaurant and you order for coffee, and the waiter tells you your coffee is being processed, or we are going to give you your coffee in few minutes. Now, in a way, that waiter is promising you that he or she is going to give you a coffee, and then at that point that the that waiter is promising you that that coffee will be given, that coffee is pending. So he has established a promise with you, but that promise is pending. So now there are two things that can happen. It's either that waiter, after some times, brings your coffee to you and be like, here is your coffee, sir, or here is your coffee, ma. Or your the waiter can come back and tell you, oh, sorry, we can't actually prepare coffees now, and this is why we couldn't prepare it. So it's the same thing with programming. So programming, you can create promises in programming, and then those promises have two outcomes. So if the promise gets resolved, so which means yes, this promise actually resolves to something, maybe it gives a desired result, then you can call a resolve function to actually show that okay, that yes, that promise has been resolved. Or if that promise um couldn't go, like it maybe didn't go well, for example, then you can actually return the reason why that promise did not go well. So that is just the simple thing about promise. So it's either the promise completes or the promise fails. And then if it completes, you send back the result of that completion. If there's a failure, you will tell why that promise is failing. So so that takes us to states of a promise. So a promise can be in one of these states. So a promise can be either pending, so which means the promise hasn't been fulfilled or rejected yet. So a promise can also be fulfilled. So when a promise is fulfilled, it means it returns maybe a desired value. Then a promise is rejected when maybe a value is not met, and then that value raises calls a function that, or the rejected function or the reject function. So that rejected now is going to send back a reason why that promise couldn't be fulfilled. I hope that makes sense to you guys. So that's the three states a promise can exist. So it's either it's pending, or it's been done, it's fulfilled, or it's being rejected. So of course we know how it works now. So how do we write it in code? So don't worry about the long code. I'll explain it line by line. So we create it. So this is the promise actually. So this is how you create a promise. So you say, let's get me a coffee equals to new promise. Then this promise accepts a function. And remember we talked about callback there. So, and we talked about anonymous function. So you see that this promise accepts a callback, and then what we are passing here is an anonymous function. Now, this function needs to have two um two arguments. Number one argument is what's the function that is going to be called when this promise is resolved. So when once this promise is resolved, this my resolve is going to be what you're going to call. But if the promise gets rejected, this is the function you're going to call. So look at how we wrote it. We said let's, so this is like simulating um the coffee example I mentioned. So get me a coffee, then okay, so get me a coffee. Maybe I tell a waiter that you should get me a coffee, and he tells me, okay, I'll do that. So when once he says that, we've established a promise. Then maybe he goes and we checks if the coffee ingredients are complete. So if it is true that these coffee ingredients are complete, so that's what I'm checking here. Is it true that these coffee ingredients are complete? If it is true, then we call my resolve, which means this resolve means okay, this promise has been fulfilled. Then we return a value, a value, So if it is maybe false that the ingredients are not enough to do the coffee, we tell him the reason why we couldn't do his coffee. So that's where this my reject comes in, which is this my reject here. So we tell him why this coffee ingredients are not complete. So this is the reason why we couldn't do his coffee. So then this is how you write the promise, and then this is how you use it. So you say, get me a coffee dot. This is how you write using promises. So you say, get me a coffee dot then. Then this then is going to pass in two arguments. It's going to pass in um, the resolve and reject. So if you notice, we are passing two functions in here. So this first function is going to handle the value when my resolve, like when this is resolved to true, when the promise is actually fulfilled. So this first function resolves that, and then this, you have your coffee is here, is being, it will be passed as a value here, and then we can do whatever I want to do with that value here inside this function. But if we have a rejection here, we the promise did not go well, then we are going to trap it in the second function, which is this particular function. So we pass the reason, which is this here, this coffee ingredient is the reason here. So that here is why we couldn't get your coffee. Then we now show the person the reason, which is what is being passed here. So pretty simple, right? You can create a promise, and you don't there, it's not by must that you must use if statements here. You can run a logic, and then maybe you check if that logic is true. Okay, we use my resolve. Okay, if it's um if it generates what um what is I hope you guys get this the point. If it generates like a positive value, that maybe you can use that value to say, okay, if it generates this particular value, it means that this promise has been resolved successfully. Then you use my resolve. But if maybe it doesn't go well, maybe after maybe your logic, the logic you've written here, you now check that logic, and then uh, maybe it's not what you expected, then you can send back the reason why that didn't go well. So let's see. I hope you guys are following. So let me see. So um, send me send me uh, send me money. I say that should be a new promise. Uh, promise and fail. But okay. So this would accept resolve and the reject. So I will call this when maybe if I want to send the person the money. So let me say I promise someone I'm going to send the person money. I'm going to send him money. I'm going to send him money. Then maybe I don't know what do I check if I want to send the person money. Okay, so um, I might decide to send money to people that have okay, to a student. So I can check uh is student equals to true. So I could check if that person is a student, for example. So I could say if that person, if it's true that that person is a student, then I would like to. What's happening? Okay, okay. If the person is student, then uh, resolve. I could send the person his money. So I'll say maybe 5K. Send the person 5K. Else, maybe if the person is not a student, then I could reject and tell the person, or I don't know, maybe it's cultist. Say if the person is a cultist, I send the person 5K. But if the person is not, then I'll tell the person maybe you want really collect, not sending. So, we've created this promise. So if I want to use it now, I'll say send me money dot then. Of course, we have resolve and we have reject here. So the first parameter is a resolve, the second one is a reject. So if you want to use that, we would say function. When you say resolve value, resolve value, then maybe we just console dot log um maybe we just console or log the resolved value. Or else we'll pass another function to handle the reject. So say uh of course, you could use this as functions outside, not as anonymous functions. So of course it always sends the reason back why that promise couldn't wasn't fulfilled. So we say so dot log and if I do that, so he gets 5k for from me. But if I'm checking, maybe after running background checks and everything, I see that it's not the cultist. Yeah, so although let me switch this because I wouldn't like to send the cultist money. So first, this is going to be resolve, and this is going to be reject. So if you're not a cultist, send you 5k. But if it's true, don't know why I should tell a cultist if he really wants to collect. All right, so that wraps it up um for this. So of course, I said you can use something else now. You can use maybe function. Let me just call this function check. You can use that function in here. Well, let me see if that works out. So I could use check. I use check here, and I say resolve. Then I use check here and say reject. So if the person is truly a cultist, okay, dot then check. It's saying resolved is not defined. Okay, So which means I have to have, I think I need to do this check and check two. Okay, saying resolved is not defined. So why is that? Okay. Let me try doing that. Okay, so I guess you need to pass in the functions. You need to pass in the functions there. So instead of using it this way, you have to definitely pass in those functions. Yeah, so sorry about that. All right, so we've seen how to write promises, seen how to use them, and another thing, this reject can also be cut. So if I did something like, if I wrote something like dot catch here, and I say reason or function, function here, function with a particular reason why that happened. I say console.log reason. So if this is false, yeah, so reject and 5k. So when you can catch your this reject, you can catch it here. So, but if it resolves, then um if that resolves, then it's going to still bring this. So it's kind of similar. It's just that you're saying when it rejects, you're kind of like treating this as kind in a way like an error that occurred, and then you want to maybe return that error. So I hope you guys are following. Is anybody that's not following? Okay, so nobody has said anything. I just explained this part, how you can catch reject using the dot catch. So of course you can name it whatever I want to name it, reason, whatever I want to name it. But I think a better name to use would be reason, not e. So we go over to how we use promise.all. So promise.all is a quite simple method, a static method, and is used to aggregate results from multiple synchronous operations. Now, promise.all method accepts a list of promises. So you can use it, you can create 5 promises, and then you want to run all those promises at the same time. So you use promise.all method to actually aggregate and call all the list of promises you want to call at the same time. So uh, then it will return the value of those promises. So I'll show you how this works very soon. So the promise method accepts a list of promises and it returns a new promise that resolves to an array of results of the input promises. If all the input promises resolved or reject with an error of the first rejected promise. So this means that this promise, when you're using promise.all, if all of the promise actually resolves, if all the promises resolve, then you will get the result from as an array for each and every promise you pass to this resolve.all. But if that doesn't work out, then if one of the promises fail, then you will get an error for the with the first reject. Like if you're running 5 promises and maybe the third promise rejects before others finish running, then you will get that error, that reject error, but it will not return the um, the results for the other promises that passed. So that means if you want to get a result from this promise.all, all the promises you pass into this promise.all has to be run. Okay, so sorry about that. Um, Let me share my screen again. Okay, so I hope you all can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Can you guys see my screen? Okay, cool.
Yes, we can see your screen. Go ahead.
So I explained about the promise.all, right? So let's see how that works. So we have 3 promises we've written here. The first promise we resolve and reject, and let's say all of the promise resolves. So the first promise resolves and it returns a value of 10, the second one resolves and returns a value of 20, the third one resolves and returns a value of 30. So if you want to run all these 3 promises at once, so the reason why we put set timeout is so that set timeout will make this one run first, then after running this one, it will run this one second, and then it will run this one third. So if we put all these promises using promise.all, we know we pass it in as an array. So if all these 3 promises run and they return a result, we can now see, we can now pass that result that is being returned to this promise using the dot then. So we pass it into a function that I want to use to handle that the results or whatever I want to name it. So now I just put the set time out chat to let it take a little time before it's uh, console or log out this 10, 20, and 30 here as results. So you see that it runs everything, right? And then after running it, after console or logging this here, it now brings back the result 10, 20, and 30. Now let's look at this particular one. So we see that is exactly the same thing. The first we have promise.all and then we have three promises, but this first promise resolves, this second promise rejects, right? While the third one resolves. So see what is going to happen. The first one runs, it's resolved. The second one is rejected. This is supposed to be rejected, not resolved. So this second one is rejected and then it throws an error. The third promise is also run, but that result we had from this first one is not from, like, the total results that was supposed to be logged out, which is this part, is no more being logged out. Why? Because one of the promises you passed in here failed. It's reject it didn't resolve. It's failed. Let's take this as pass and fail, for example. So this promise actually passed, this one failed, while this particular one passed. So since one from the promises you passed in failed, so it won't console or log out the results. But let's go to the previous one. So all the three promises passed, and then we got a result back, which was this dot then, which ran. So before we go to promise.trace, let's see how to actually make that happen. So let me just copy this again and paste. Send me get me coffee, for example. So I use that, get me coffee. So if I want to run all of them at the same time, say promise.all, and then I pass in send me money, and get me coffee. After passing that, I use dot then, dot then um maybe the result. I pass in the result like that. And of course, I like using arrow functions. I know I mentioned about arrow functions once. Instead of me writing function, then so this is also anonymous because it doesn't have a name. This is the result. This is the same thing as doing. This is the same thing as uh, writing this. It's exactly the same thing. So if you don't use arrow functions, you can use the normal function the way we write it. So that's sure by the way. So I might decide I want to console.log. I'm tired of typing this console.log. So let me do what I used to do. So instead of that, I'll just use here L and I pass in the results there. So you see that it's returning the results, like it's returning the two results. So now I know you want to ask what if it fails? Then that's where you have dot catch. If anyone fails, you have dot catch and then maybe you call that reason. I'm using arrow functions there, so I could decide to log out the reason. Let's say maybe one of these fails because I use false here. This is what is going to happen. It's not going to print out, it's only going to print out the reason why this particular one failed. So I changed this to false, and it would just, so when these promises are being called, since one fails, it will return the reason for that one, and it won't return this result anymore. So I won't be able to see the result of the two. But of course, if none of them fails, I have um the result. So that's how. So you can, it's not only, you can put as many number of, like, as much number of promises you want to actually run. So use promise dot all to run all those promises. Okay. So having looked at promise.all, which you can use to call all the promises, and we've looked at some examples, let's look at promise.raise. Here, the first promise to resolve will have its value or reason for failing return. So this promise.raise is different from promise.run in the sense that in a race, actually, there's always a winner, and there's other runners or people that didn't win. So this race is used to catch the result of the first promise that is being executed. So if I have two promises and then one executes before another, then that particular one that executes, if that promise is resolved, like it sends back a result, for example, then the value of that result resolved is what the user is going to see, or is what the user is going to see, like is what you can get when you use dots then. But if it rejects, it's going to send an error. So it's based on, even if you have five promises, the first promise that runs is what the race is going to actually um, take into consideration. Let, so um, okay, so I didn't give an example for this. So let me show you how that works here. So I'm sorry I didn't put an example there. So I would include it. So now this is going to make sense I if I set timeout to simulate which promise executes first. So I say set timeout and then a function to be executed. Then that function checks for that, and then this particular function should execute after 2 seconds. Then of course I could just simply copy this and paste here. But I want this one to, so instead of using this, let me call this second promise executed. I'll call this or instead of that, uh so I'll just call L here, and then maybe I'll choose to resolve it to 10, and I do the same thing here. I'll change this to first promise executed, and maybe I'll change this to maybe let me change this to 20. Now of course these two are going to resolve to true, but this first one is the one that is going to get executed, and that is what we are going to consider. So second promise executes first, and then first promise is okay. I didn't change this to race. So on your marks, get set, ready, promise. You see, so the first promise is being executed, and then the value, okay, sorry, the second promise is being executed, and then after the second promise is being executed, the value of that we are returning from the second promise is what the result actually shows, right? But this other one, this first promise resolves after 2 seconds, and then even as it's being resolved, its value is not sent back. So so now what you can understand, like see clearly, is that get coffee, which is this first promise, came first. So its promise ran first, and then this one came second. This other promise here came second. So this first promise object, now the the result of this first project, this first promise object is what is being returned. The second one, the second promise object, which is this 10 now, is not being returned. But let's say, what if the first one that wins the race actually um, returns, like it fails. So if we change this to false, and then we know that since we change this to false, this will actually resolve to reject. So if we run it, it would, yes. So it returns now. Notice another thing now. It returns the reason why it rejects, right? And then it's also executes this particular one. But the only thing, in fact, what happens here is after returning this 5k, this 5k is being run by this catch. Then this first promise now becomes executed. But this first promise, since it still came second again, so its value cannot be gotten. So I know that might be a bit confusing because um, because of the fact that, okay, we wrote this one here, we wrote this particular one here, but we are seeing 5k and we are seeing first promise executed. So just understand that the first promise to win the race, of course, I said that you can have a promise, and then as that promise is executing, any other program in your code can in your any other code in your program, like any other thing you've written, can actually execute. So we call two promise, and one promise executes before the other. So that first promise that executes before the other is what we are actually going to consider, and we are going to check if it resolves. So if it sends a valid result, or if there is a reason why it could not send a valid result. So, but um, this brings another. This brings us to another problem that can occur. So there's this thing called callback hell. So send money. So let me see how I can actually am I correct? So there is what I want to actually make out. Get me a coffee is get me a coffee. Oh, send me money. Okay. Send me money. What's wrong? Okay. So we have send me money. We set the time out. Okay. So I guess let me just remove this set timeout. So this is what I want to actually do. Or no, instead of that, let's take one. So it actually runs, but I don't know why this is actually coming up. I guess if I run the same code offline, it won't generate this error. Not going to generate it. So another thing is we see that the result is 10. Another you could now do could now do maybe I don't know, get me coffee, but then so this is already bad. So then you now say a function. So I'm trying to simulate callback hell or something like that. So function maybe v, then you have value here, uh, log out the value. So let's see how that plays out. Then after that, you use dot. Then if there is an error or reason, tell me the reason. Because this should be true because I don't want any reason to fire. So now look at this code is it's confusing. We have we have a first promise, and then inside that first promise, if you have like let's say five promises and you didn't use the promise dot all, for example, you might run into callback hell trying to call a promise and maybe call another promise inside that promise and call another promise again inside the promise. So your promise will become onions. You have promise and you have another promise inside that promise and you have another promise inside that particular promise. So that's having promises nested inside other promises leads to what is called callback hell. So you have promise pile up inside promises too. So you can use async await to instead of using promises. So let's talk about async await. So there's a special syntax to work with promises in a more comfortable fashion. So that syntax is called async await. So then the word async before a function simply means the function will always return a promise. So this makes sense. So if you have a function that you want to use and then you want to write a promise inside that function, so you use async to, it's like saying you're expecting that function to return a promise. Then the await keyword now. So let's look at what the await keyword does. So The keyword await makes JavaScript wait until the promise is settled. So you use await inside the async function. So when you have async, you have to await inside that function. So you're telling the function, I'm going to return a promise to you, but I have to wait until this promise is fulfilled before I can return the promise to you, or the result of the promise to you. So that's how async await works. So without async await, you might be using .then.catch to actually, or resolve rejecting the .then, maybe writing functions inside there. But with await and async, it's more simpler to actually work with promises. So let's see an example of how to use async await. So we have this function that has a promise in it. Okay, so we said inside that function, we said let the promise equals to new promise, we resolve and reject, and then we just resolve the promise. We don't have any reject there. So when we resolve this promise, we can we can decide to do what with, you can decide whatever we want to do with the result from this promise. So when we await, we can assign this await the promise to a variable. We can return that variable. We can console.log it. So now this awaits the promise. This promise itself will be resolved to 10. So you can console.log out that out. That will give you 10. You can return it to the function and decide to console.log that out and the rest. So let's see how that works out. So let me clear out all this except that lock. So I hope you're following. Okay. So let's continue. So function, of course, is an async function. I can't forget that. So it means it's going to return a promise. Anytime you do that, you're saying it's going to return a promise. So you can call this uh promise. You can call that the promise. Then you can have let's maybe I don't know what to actually use. Um, Maybe travel to Lagos should be equals to a new promise. That promise accepts a function, has resolve and rejects. Of course, we just want to, after sometimes, let's say after a minute, we just want to resolve it. Just want to, we can decide to check and resolve or reject, but I just want to resolve it to keep things simple. So I could resolve to um coming, or um I'm on my way. I'm on my way. Then we passing the time. So we say it should wait for 1 second before it executes, it resolves. And then after all this, okay, so that's where the promise ends. I can decide to return. So before that, we can store the promise. So we can say let the result or promise result, let promise result equals to, we want to wait Want to wait for this promise, which is travel to Lagos. So we want to wait for travel to Lagos, and then we can decide to return the promise results. So I promise I'm going to travel to Lagos. Now, if we call this function, now it's going to return the promise results. So if we log out that promise result, so the promise, so we call it there, and set time out. Sorry, I put O in capital letter. It's supposed to be small letters. So we see that the promise is pending, and then um, I think I should just use console.log here. So why isn't that printing the result? Okay. So I guess what I'm supposed to do is promise results. Okay, so that shows us I'm on my way. So we see that um, even if we console.log this, console.log it, we see that first it returns that promise before it actually resolves it. So you have this promise. So before this actually ran and then we console.log the results, we had um, a pending promise. Then after, when that promise is being fulfilled, we have the results from that particular promise. So this is how to actually use promises. So if I don't want to show when the promise is pending, I could just run it like that. And while the promise is pending, after the promise pends and then it resolves, we now get. So someone might ask, so how do we catch errors here? So you can use try. Can put all this in here and use catch the reason why I didn't travel. If there's a reason and I change this to reject, uh, uh, for flight, okay. So you see, now I'm trapping the reason here. So I say my reason was that the money for flight wasn't complete, but if this was resolved, so you can have a variable to check that. So if that was resolved and I said I'm on my way, of course we see I'm on my way there. So with that being said, we've come to the end of the class for today. So practice more about promises, callbacks, we are going to look at more other methods, and we are going to look deeply into async await and other concepts of asynchronous programming in our next class. So till then, thanks for coming, and see you next week.